Welcome to another video by 12istic. In this video, we will be discussing about the figures of speech part B of the poem 2.5 Father Returning Home by Dilip Chitre. So before we begin with figures of speech, I would like to tell you how questions will be asked based on the figures of speech in your board exam. So the first one is name and explain the figures of speech. The second is pick any two examples of figures of speech. The third one is find examples of figures of speech in the poem. The fourth one is complete the table of figures of speech and explain. The fifth one is identify and write the line of the poem which has a specific figures of speech being asked in the exam. And the last one is, that is the sixth one, identify the rhyme scheme. So now let us begin with the figures of speech of poem Father Returning Home by Dilip Chitre. The first one is, my father travels on the late evening train. This figure of speech is alliteration, as the sound of T is repeated for the poetic effect. The second one is standing among silent commuters in the yellow light. This figure of speech is alliteration, as the sound of S is repeated for the poetic effect. The third one, suburbs slide past his unseeing eyes. This figure of speech is alliteration, as the sound of S is repeated for the poetic effect. The fourth one is his shirt and pants are soggy and his black raincoat. This figure of speech is alliteration, as the sound of S is repeated for the poetic effect. The fifth one, stained with mud and his bag stuffed with books. This figure of speech is alliteration, as the sound of S and B is repeated for the poetic effect. The sixth one is falling apart, his eyes dimmed by age. This figure of speech is metaphor, as indirect comparison is made between eyes dimmed and tiredness. The seventh one, fade homewards through the humid monsoon night. This figure of speech is alliteration, as the sound of H is repeated for the poetic effect. The eighth one is like a word dropped from a long sentence. This figure of speech is simile, as direct comparison here is made between word dropping and father getting off. The ninth one, he hurries across the length of the grey platform. This figure of speech is metaphor, as indirect comparison is made between grey platform with old age. The 10th one, he hurries across the length of grey platform, crosses the railway line, enters the lane. His chappals are sticky with mud, but he hurries onwards. This figure of speech is repetition, as the word hurries is repeated for the poetic effect. The 11th one, home again, I see him drinking weak tea. This figure of speech is alliteration, as the sound of H is repeated for the poetic effect. Also, this figure of speech is personification, as a human quality of being weak is given to the tea. The 12th one, man's estrangement from a man-made world. This figure of speech is alliteration, as the sound of M is repeated for the poetic effect. Also, this figure of speech is repetition, as the word man is repeated for the poetic effect. The 13th one, the cold water running over his brown hand. This figure of speech is transferred epithet, as the epithet brown is transferred from men to his hand. The 14th one, his sullen children have often refused to share. This figure of speech is alliteration, as the sound of S is repeated for the poetic effect. And the last one, 15th, listening to the static on the radio, dreaming. This figure of speech is onomatopoeia, as it represents the sound of the radio. So that's it for today's video, Figures of Speech, Father Returning Home. Stay tuned for our next educational video on my YouTube channel 12istic. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.